Hello, and welcome back to Into the Verse. This is episode 2, and in this episode, we'll be looking more into these verse devices. We'll kind of dive deeper into how Fortnite interacts with these devices, as well as how we can format these to be a little bit better on our eyes. Should be a short episode, just discussing the architecture of how to get your code in game and how to work with that. So let's dive right in. So first I'll switch over to Visual Studio Code here, and this may look familiar if you were here for the last episode. This should be exactly how we left it. So let's start by kind of running down each of these lines and trying to understand what they mean. So let's start at the top here at line 2. As I have a space here, I'm going to delete this space, but line 1 now, we have these using statements, right? Now these using statements, essentially what they do is they allow us to bring in extra functionality from outside of our code base. So these 3 that I have here, you can see that I'm using one from Fortnite.com, and it's devices. I'm using this one from verse.org called simulation, and I'm using this one unrealengine.com/temporary/diagnostics. Now, as a rule of thumb with these is you want as few of these per file as possible. You really only want the ones that you're going to be using. Now, as far as how Verse compiles down into the game code or C++ or whatever the interpreter does for us, I don't know if they, if it looks through our code and says, oh, well, they're not actually using one of these, so we can discard the library, the module. We don't care about it. But that might not be the case. So, just as another rule of thumb, it's better to have a clean file to look at rather than, trying to parse through the file and saying, I don't know, is this used anywhere? I'm not sure. So the compiler will tell us if they're used or not. If I go ahead and remove this final using statement here on line 3, the Unreal Engine temporary diagnostics, if I just remove that, we'll see that we have no errors, and that is because we weren't using that anywhere. There was nowhere in our file that we were actually accessing anything from that module. Now with these 2, we are accessing them, but I'm going to show you what happens if I remove one anyways. So actually, we might not even be using simulation here, but we definitely are using devices. So I'll show you what happens when I remove this one. As you can see, now we have a bunch of errors. And the reason we have a bunch of errors is because of this part right here, which we'll get into. But we are attempting to use something called a creative device, which is something that is part of Fortnite that Epic gives us. However, we don't have access to anything called creative device within the scope of our current code base. That was coming from that using statement that I'll go ahead and replace here, fortnite.com/devices. Now again, if I remove this and I hover over this error, it'll actually tell me the reason why it's throwing the error. So in this case, we have an unknown identifier, creative device, and it'll actually try to specify which module it thinks it should come from. And in this case, it's correct. It is the fortnite.com/devices. So that's why if I keep this line up here, it'll be happy and it won't have any errors. One thing to do when you're writing these, I'm gonna go ahead and one more time delete this just to show you. Now this won't work every time. I believe how the language server works, or whatever is interacting with VS Code here. It should only work when you already have a using statement in the file. But if you are needing a new using statement, for this instance, we need the fortnite.com/devices. I can start typing using, and you'll see it pops up for me. If I just hit tab, I'm able to actually create this using statement in our curly brackets without having to go through the pain of typing them out, and it'll actually even put my the characters that I'm editing, it'll highlight those for me, so I can just start typing here. And if I do /fortnite.com/devices, there we go. These are kind of a one of those things that you start to understand with experience. The more you use Verse, the more you're going to be using these using statements, and it'll just kind of flow. Eventually, it'll be to the point where you'll be programming and then you'll hit an error, but you already know what the error is. Like if you're trying to work with vector 3s, vector math, we'll get into that eventually. I know that I'll be needing unrealengine.com/temporary/spatial spatial math. And like if you're new to UEFN and verse, there's no way that you would just off top of your head know that you need this, but it does just come with experience. So try not to feel overwhelmed by any of these. Okay, so moving on, we covered this last time, but this is a comment. Anything with the it's green text and it's got this hashtag or the pound sign from whatever generation you're from beforehand, that just means that all the text on that line is not going to be read by the compiler. The game doesn't care about it anyway. It's just for us to read. So I could put whatever here and it wouldn't matter. I'm going to go ahead and remove these comments because, excuse me, I have the hiccups right now. We don't need them. A verse authored creative device that can be placed in a level. Yeah, we know that, so I don't need that. I like to keep my files as clean as possible, right? I want to be able to read them without running into things that are kind of useless, like this to do. Replace this with your code. Well, we've already put some of our code in here, and we'll continue adding to it. So I'm just going to remove that comment as well, not the line above. There we go. And runs the device when the device is started running in game. Now this will leave because we're about to actually talk about this, but before we do that, let's talk about this line above it, verse tutorials device. Now if you named your device as the same as me, this is what you'll see, but you might see whatever you named it when we were making our verse device. This and it's in snake case is what we call this, right, where it's all lowercase letters and each individual word is separated by underscores. That's the proper way to write class names in verse. So that's what we have here. So verse tutorials device, that is the name of my class, and you can tell it's a class because I'm setting it equal to, with this little colon equal right here, class. And what type of class is it, you wonder? It is of type creative device. So we'll go further into what inheritance means and all these different programming concepts. But for right now, what I want you to get from this is that we have made our own thing called a class, which is like a container. It contains different things. It can contain functionality. It can contain data, things like that. And we are setting it equal to, right? The name of it is equal to the type is equal to a class, and the class is what's called inheriting another class, creative device. This is a class that we didn't make. This is part of Fortnite, and I'm going to show you something cool here. Now, it's important to keep in mind that when you try to do this, if you have any errors in your file, you probably won't be able to do this. So you have to make sure there's no red lines anywhere. So you can hold Control on your keyboard, and as you see, as I put my mouse around, sometimes things will have there'll be blue text with a line underneath. Whenever that shows up, I'm actually able to left click on such a thing, and it'll take me to where that thing is. So as you can see, it took me to this other file here, Fortnite.digest.verse. I'm going to double click that so it's permanent, so it doesn't go away. But here is the creative device. Again, this is code that I did not write. This is that Epic wrote for us to be able to be used in our game. And there's a lot of things here. Don't feel overwhelmed by them. We're just going to be looking at one of them here, and that is this on begin. As you can see, it's it's a line of text here with a bunch of words that doesn't probably make too much sense right now, and that's okay. We just care about what the comment tells us, right? Before we get to this comment, actually, let's read the comment about the creative device. So, inherit from this to create a custom creative device. This is what we did last time, right? We created the file. If I go back, this, because it's inside of these parentheses, we're inheriting it. So it says inherit from this to create a custom creative device. Inherited classes will appear in the UEFN content browser the next time verse compiles. Instances of your derived creative device that can then be placed in your island by dragging them from the content browser into the scene. And that makes exactly sense as to what we did last time, right? When we opened our content browser, our creative devices folder, which again we didn't make, UEFN made for us, contained our verse tutorials device, which is exactly what we would expect from this text. So now that we understand how these objects are put into the game and what it means to put one into the game, even though we might not know all of the details of what they can do, let's understand one of the details of what they do. This onBegin function. So override to add custom logic when the game experience begins. Now that might not make total sense here, but I promise it will. So if we go back to our file here, this is our VerseTutorials device, we can see that we have our own version of onBegin right here. And we have this thing right here that says override. And the reason we have this is because onBegin is a function that is part of the creative device class, the one that Epic gives us. Now, we want to be able to, we want this to be called, essentially, right? We want this to run when our game starts. It's kind of the purpose of onBegin. However, in order to make sure that we are using the correct onBegin, that is the one that's called by the game when the game starts, or rather when our device is enabled, we have to make sure that we tell the compiler we want to override functionality, which is what this keyword right here does. So if I were to remove this override, it would actually complain, and we can hover over to see why. This says this function overrides a superclass function, our superclass being the creative device, and our subclass or our child class is the VerseTutorials device. And it says overrides a superclass function but has no override attribute. This is basically saying, hey, we can tell you're trying to run something in your onBegin function, which is a function of creative device. However, you're not telling us that you want to override the functionality, so we have to do that. So I'm going to go ahead and do override, just how we took out, and it'll stop complaining. Now this suspense keyword, we'll get into this later. We actually don't need this right now. And I'm a fan of whenever you don't need something to remove it. There's no point in having it. It just kind of makes things a little more cluttered. We know that this onBegin function is going to run as soon as this device is enabled or when the game starts. So I'm going to remove that as well. The last thing I want to do before we kind of dive into what we can do with onBegin is format this a little. So as you know, if you're on the internet and you're looking at VerseTutorials or you're looking at other people's code, I'm sure this is probably the standard of what you see. You use a colon to denote a basically an object, right? And then you use white space, like in this case, spaces or tabs, to signify that this is part of this, right? onBegin exists inside of our VerseTutorials device because we have this colon and then we have all this white space. Now, this is fine, and if you want to program this way, don't let anyone stop you. However, I prefer to use curly brackets. I come from other programming languages where curly brackets are required, and I think they, personally, I feel like they make the project easier to parse. Right? I want someone to be able to read my code without me having to explain to them what it does, and I think curly brackets just enables a little more ability to quickly and easily read something. So instead of this colon, again, if you want to do it this way, totally fine. I'm going to go ahead with all future things in this tutorial series, I'm going to use curly brackets. So I'm going to delete this colon. It's going to yell at me because it doesn't know what to do. I'm going to add a curly bracket on the line below. I'm going to delete the extra one it gives me, and I'm going to add one on the very line below. As you can see, it stopped yelling at me, and now it's very clear to me when I click on this curly bracket, and even when I don't, there's a line here, and I can actually collapse this, right, on this little arrow next to 5. And this just makes it really clear to me that, okay, everything in between these curly brackets is part of this thing. And I want to do that same thing with our onBegin function, right? We have these lines of code, if you remember from the last episode, where we're printing things to the game itself. However, you know, you could mistake this and not realize there's white space here and accidentally write something outside of the white space, or maybe you're trying to add something to the class but not to onBegin, but your spacing is wrong, so you might throw it in here on accident. Just to make our lives easier, I'm going to do the exact same thing. So I'm going to add a line, I'm going to backspace here, add my curly bracket, and then I'm going to do the same thing on the bottom line. And now it's very clear. Okay, everything in between these brackets is onBegin, and again, I can collapse it if I want to. One other thing I enjoy doing, again, not required, but I like to space out some of my text here. So onBegin, override, and then my parameters. That's all okay. But afterwards, I'm going to put a space between the parameters, the colon, my void, and my equals. It just makes it a little easier on my eyes. I can tell Here's the name of the function. Oh, it takes no parameters, and we're returning void, and we'll get into what that means in a bit. But that just makes it easier on the eyes, I believe. Okay, so now that we understand, what a creative device is and what actually it means when we're implementing, I think that's a good place to end this episode. In the next episode, we're going to be diving into how the onBegin works and essentially writing new code to do some linking of things. So we're going to look at event binding through Verse as opposed to event binding through UEFN. Thanks so much for watching. I'll catch you next time.